Sounds good. Well, good afternoon to anyone watching this live or to those tuning into this later on, the recording. My name is Tommy Doles. I am an employee at Lincoln Memorial University in the athletic department, but also a student in the MPA program. I was a political science student as an undergraduate, and I'm thrilled to hear from our next speaker of the 2022 Zoom-A-Palooza. And so I have the honor of introducing Dr. Frederick Gordon. Dr. Gordon is the director of the Masters of Public Administration program at ETSU, and he has been teaching for over 20 years and teaching classes in American politics, select courses in international relations, and has a research focus in environmental policy and has even looked at the intersection of environmental policy and the presidency. So today, Dr. Gordon is going to be speaking on diversity and inclusion within government, and definitely looking forward to it. So Dr. Gordon, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to share the screen here and make sure everybody can see. Right? Everybody can see my slides? Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me and participating in the Zoom-A-Palooza. I always enjoy being involved with academic endeavors and sharing and offering new insight in terms of research as well as teaching strategies and things like that. And today I bring to you a very interesting, important area about something that you probably all have heard of, but may not quite understand the full context about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's a federal policy and access, I might add there, I put the hyphen there at the end, access, because it's very important. And so my discussion today will be to talk about this model, assess what's at stake, look at data, and link it to what you hear about the Title VII and Title IX, and then offer insight. I thought in terms of the Zoom-A-Palooza, a lot of it has to do or addresses concerns of state and local government. So I try to offer insight about the DIA model, but also at the end make an angle towards state behavior in addressing this. So one of the things to think about when we hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion or accessibility, obviously it's about it's a classic component for us to appreciate civil rights protection, and in many respects Title VII, an extension. Some people may want to understand where does this model emanate from, and in research a lot of it goes back to the 1960s. There's no one juncture point, but I think we can look at it like that. Some schools such as Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh link it that way, and that's something to consider. It's ultimately the thing about the DEIA model is it's about inclusion. And when we think about that, that is really a critical business strategy. Or we think about it in terms of public administration, it's about a way or ways to make an agency more accountable, more inclusive, more effective, and it's certainly more inviting for people to work there in terms of serving from a clientele or constituents from a public service type of word. So this is a really important consideration. Some people may even look at it in terms of a public choice perspective because it has a rational component in terms of looking about addressing agency efficiency and potentially equitable outcomes. So there's several different angles towards it. And ultimately, I love to, in my talks, to offer some quotes. And obviously, when you think about diversity, we think about Gandhi, obviously, how important diversity really is. It's obviously this structural concept of our ability to reach unity in diversity will be the beauty and the test of our civilization. And if you do a little searching about that, it's a very well noted, so many different sources cite Gandhi in this. It's really a beautiful perspective to look at and so forth. But there's different terminologies that are equated with the DEIA model. We hear the term equity too. And in many respects, it's about promotion of equality. We hear equity. Often my policy classes address question marks in terms of how to promote equity and how to make sure people have equal opportunity to participate in society and so forth. And that's really what the DEIA model is really spearheading, the idea of societal members should have the same prospects for success. That's what's so critical. And one of the measures for us to consider here today is to think about it in terms of addressing non-dominant groups such as women, racial, ethnic minorities, the LGBTQ individuals and communities, and those with disabilities, all critical, important contributors for in society and for any organization or government agency. But I wanted to, this is a little bit of a preview here. And one of the things I want us to think about is how far have we come? Have we really thought about that? Diversity, where do we start from? I know for those who study public administration, we say that in many respects that the government is the best reflection of diversity or diversity representation. But is it good enough? And how far have we, what kind of market changes have we made over the years? And that's kind of the journey that I want to take with you today, to get you to think, to measure, to evaluate where it's not just simply saying what a model is, but how effective it is. One of the things I always like to do is to look at, and I love sharing this with my students, within Congress. Should Congress be, if we're focusing on the DEIA model, is Congress a function of diversity and so forth? So you look over here, I'm going to show you data from different sessions in Congress. This is the most recent one. You see the 117th session, and you see in some contexts some broader components of racial and ethnic diversity. So you can see it certainly through the Black community, Hispanic, some of Asian American communities. And so that's really probably more in the House than in the Senate, but you get an idea of some of the areas that we can look at here, right? So there is a greater effort in that capacity. Not every, I want to give a little perspective here. Not every chart that I will show you will reflect this perspective, and that's just something for us to consider here. And so we see here that this is another component. This goes up to 2020. The idea of the white Americans make up the large share of Congress and the U.S. population. So there's still not as broad diversity as one might think. So there's just some of the a little bit of a juxtaposition. As I said, if our takeaway so far is to think about the bureaucracy is the most diverse entity within the governmental structure. And let's see. Okay, so they make a large share of Congress, and whites make up a larger share of the Congress than of the U.S. population. So, okay, looking at that context. And then ultimately the gender gap, or the gender framework here, you can see through the, through 2017, you can see the percentage of members who are women. You can see how the gaps, certainly there's some increases and so forth. If you look back in years in the past, obviously it's much different, but still ways to go. And then interestingly enough, looking at older data, you can see here foreign-born share of people who are in Congress remain relatively small. And further on here, veterans too, it's interesting. I always found this an interesting component that you can see here, that the percentage of people in Congress with military service, wow, it's really, it's really dropped considerably. It's an amazing consideration here all the way down. And as I said, sometimes my data is from the current Congress or prior to the 116th session, but it's still interesting to look at here. And now, obviously, other components to education in today's times, just about everybody has a college degree. It's always of interest as well. So what I'm trying to get you to think about is that maybe the front lines is Congress could be a good reflection of trying to improve or to make more measurable, diverse changes and things like that. And obviously, you can see here too from religious identity makeup, and you can see here that there is diversity in terms of religious identity. Certainly dominant Protestant ideology or variations of Protestant religion, but the thing is that you see other groups having some significance as well. So there's some diversity in religious perspectives. And then obviously you can see it here too. This is just from the 116th, but it just gives you some ideas about House and Senate construct. And going forward here, you can see this is an interesting data too. You can consider here as well a little bit back, but you can see that again, a different group makeup and so forth. But one of the things that it's abundantly clear when we consider there's more diversity in the House than in the Senate. I think that's particularly clear. This I use again too. It gives you some perspective as well that you have this. Well, this is just more of a party makeup and so forth. But I just wanted to give you some comparison, contrast, and so forth to current session. And in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, we see again as we look at it, there seems to be some incremental. Certainly over the years, in the last 20 years, you start to see some greater representation, certainly racial ethnic diversity. So it's important for us to think about this in terms of being able to connect it to the DEIA model to help us to consider these things. Now, clearly, as I go forward here in our discussion, it's important to recognize that the whole idea of this model is designed to make American government agencies more responsive to the public and ultimately to be inclusive, to make sure that people can have equal opportunity to obtain employment, but to feel comfortable in whatever employment capacity that they are involved with. And so that's one of the things to consider. And I've done a lot of thinking, and I haven't seen the research in this context yet, but if for public administration students, maybe business students, you hear the term ROI, which means return on investment. And I want you to think about it in that context in terms of the idea of trying to make sure that people stay. Because you know what, everybody, if people aren't comfortable in a position and you hire them and then they leave after 2 or 3 years, if they're not comfortable, they felt marginalized and things like that, and you have to go rehire people again, it's not a good business model. It's not a good government service model. And that's one of the things to think about here. And the end of the day is that you really want to avoid that. And I think we talk about it from a social dimension as an extension of civil rights or even affirmative action policy. But I think ultimately, it's really it's a critical value point to help us to appreciate the idea of being more efficient. And so in many respects here, we think about it in terms of we don't want to go into reduction in force. Reduction in force obviously is when you have cutbacks and things like that. But I always like to bring those as the parameters. It's in many respects when we think about things in terms of you think about economics from recession to inflation, you want to avoid either. You want a return on investment, you want to be away from any reduction in force for one reason or another, people leaving and so forth. In many respects, I think, or at least I make the claim that the DIA model is linked to new public management. For those who don't know, new public management is really a more late 20th century construct in really linking government agency assessment with the private sector, basically adopting more efficient models to the private sector or from the private sector. And more importantly, or just as importantly, it's linking communication between management and employees. So it's not, you kind of take away the distance between upper management and regular workers and so forth. And the other thing to think about is I say to you ways to approach the DEI model, and I realize I should say investment there. I did a spell check. I don't know what happened there. But anyway, you have the ROI model, you have versus the reduction in force, and then I go on to link it to the new public management component. And ultimately, I want you to take we understand too, we don't want to see people's civil rights being violated. And ultimately, that could be, we know the history. We know what any vulnerable groups, what they suffered and experienced and so forth. And I just want you to think about that has to be an underlying component too. We want people to feel empowered. We want people to have due process. We want people to feel that they're equally part of the governing system with all rules, which includes the rules of law and so forth. And I always said, I always like to use James Madison, citing in Federalist 51, the necessity of a responsive government. Maybe that's changed over time, or maybe the efficacy of laws have changed and so forth. But what I want us to consider here is to recognize the idea that government has to be responsible, but not only just responsible to its citizenry, but also protect people from each other too. And I don't mean that in a nefarious way and so forth, but to show another, basically vertical and horizontal accountability. And I think that's the key thing to help with that. And the idea about the DEIA model really hones in on the reflection of leveling the playing field. And ultimately, that's what I think is so valuable about this process. Now, interestingly enough, if somebody were to say, what is the DIA model? It's about, I think the buzzword so much is inclusiveness, that people have access to viable work, but not only that, they are participants in whatever agency that they're involved with and so forth. And the idea is that the DIA model reflects acceptance of all groups and making sure that it's a holistic, comfortable environment. And the bottom line is that a culture that is inclusive, that is respectful of all different groups and ideas and things like that, certainly can create a stronger blend in terms of reflecting or certainly meeting needs of its citizenry. And ultimately, there's a lot of data out there. If you do a search on this section, you'll notice that it's not only being promoted by the federal government, state governments, the private sector. It's really a critical thing to think about here. And ultimately, it's going to increase. And so what that means is obviously management or certain personnel practices are looking at things more holistically, more cultural sensitivity wise, getting new ideas, and new approaches to and insight into running an agency. And I think that's the thing to think about. And I don't think it's just going to jump over the next 3 years. I think ultimately this is a long-term trend that's really catching fire right now. So these are some of the things to look into. And so the DI model And sometimes you may see it as the DEI or DEIA. Sometimes it's with regards to access. And that's one of the things to look at. And the theory or the approach here in terms of diversity and inclusion is really designed to promote equity and access. And if you think about it, that is so critical in terms of a viable component, because I think a lot of it has to do with benefits as well, relating to equitable health, wealth outcomes, and that's the general framework. Now, the question that may be percolating here is, well, how do you measure it, right? How are you able to come out with to make sure these terms are actually being met and that there's a significant difference? And I think that's where a lot of the research is going to come into. So I guess the whole idea here is, when we think about it, we look to the federal government. Federal government is the one who really has spearheaded this initiative, because in many levels it there have been executive orders designed to promote this framework, and that's one of the things to consider here. So the idea is that the government, the federal government, must be a model for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and all employees are treated with dignity and respect. Now, that's a big statement to make, because there's always issues in terms of hostile work environment, but we'll get into that too, as a little bit to look at some of the protective perspectives here. I want you to just understand that it's about this model. Certainly is spearheaded by the federal government. It's promoting talent, removing barriers to equal opportunity. President Biden's first day, he signed an executive order that would address the DEI model. And so it's not the first time we've seen that. We see it under the Obama administration, also an executive order. Now, executive orders are kind of always it's a multiple component here, because they are ways to issue directives without going through Congress and so forth. And one of the things to think about is that it's about addressing diversity, inclusion in the workplace. Specifically, that should be addressed within hiring plans and recruitment plans. Cultural awareness may mean ultimately having educational days reflecting or educating people about or their cultures and customs and practice and so forth. The question that comes into play again is the measurable outcomes. That is where I think the flashpoint is, where how do you measure a lot of these things to look at? And that's to make sure there's an effectiveness there. As I said to you, that the government's efforts, that's an important procedural component. The question that we have to still advance is, what about the question in terms of substantive? So if you can see here, this is a long-term initiative. This is the most, or certainly the most recent executive orders addressing this. It's not just only looking at, we look back just for a second here. This was promoting diversity and inclusion in the workplace, an earlier executive order. We see here advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. So you can see the government's taking a strong perspective here. And ultimately, just last June, another executive order creating a government-wide initiative to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. So the government's clearly, this administration is clearly behind this approach here. Now, this is where I think I was saying to you about the data part. They say if you can, data is one of the most compelling things that tells a story and so forth. Data-driven approach, how we promote that is to basically foster transparency and accountability. And so some people say that it really comes down to, we look at the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's Management Directive 714, which basically is a guideline approach for how affirmative programs could be addressed and so forth. And ultimately, this really has to do with more than just simply, it has to do a lot with focusing on how these strategic plans can be implemented. That's the key thing to think about here as well. And so this has to do with reporting, looking at between expected and observed outcomes. And that's the thing to look at. What I can say to you here is that there needs to be an evidentiary-based and data-driven approach to determine whether, or to the extent that government agencies result still remain in inequitable employment outcomes. This is one of the things we want to think of, try to avoid that component. And ultimately, I think the DI methods to plumb here, to measure further, is to look at the merit system or merit system principles, obviously to look at how that is being addressed. So I think if we're going to look at it in terms of measuring or effective measuring, we want to look at the merit system principles, really, which in many respects, we protect workers from whistleblowing or unfair termination practices, and ultimately making sure that they have fair and equitable treatment, all aspects of personnel management. Remember, when you working in the government, you're dealing with a property right, a legal construct. So ultimately that has to be protected. So there's a lot of different aspects to think about here too. And as I said, the literature is pretty broad in terms of things to think about. But I think one of the things that you could come away with here is to recognize and have an understanding of underserved communities and the impact, and ultimately how the DEIA model is supposed to create more of an inclusive vantage point, so people could feel not only just obtaining employment, but ultimately participating in decision making and ultimately maximizing their capabilities to the fullest extent. And I think that's one of the most important things to consider. And ultimately, the idea is that in terms of measuring, there needs to be a broad framework in terms of a DEIA plan or a strategic management plan. A lot of this goes back to the Office of Personnel Management, setting up guidelines, disseminating information to different federal agencies. Now, I know this is from a federal construct, but I'll get to how I see it to the state level in a little bit. So this is something to think about. I think our operative word here is really about agency efficacy or efficiency, and in terms of delineating clear system-wide information about how things should be disseminated. And obviously here too, when we think about the DEIA model, I want you to pay broad attention to the idea that there's different areas, segments about where evaluations can take place, because from those who've studied or may not be always familiar with all personnel management practices, but there's different sections, there's different components to it. You think about it, there is components in terms of recruitment and hiring, background investigation, promotion, retention, and performance evaluation. And I think one of the things to look at is in terms of effective measurement, there should be links to these different areas, or certainly development of surveys to be able to look into these different variables to address the DEIA model efficacy. Now, what I've presented to you so far is a lot to do with the general definition, some federal government perspectives too. I just wanted to share some ideas, a little bit another angle from more of the scholarly community, and then ultimately take you back into a little bit more of a link into the state angle, at least how I want to approach this. And so there's different people, or scholars from different universities who talk about the idea about what it's really all about. Sometimes you hear diversity, but it's really at the end of the day, how we're going to be able to implement such programs. And the idea is, again, and this is a very big buzzword too, you have to measure. I mean, you can be stylistic and procedural based, but what matters gets measured, and that's the thing to think about. Okay, so, is there a question here? Should I address questions now?
We'll do that in the last 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Okay. So I'll get to that. Yeah. So that's some of the things to look at here. And obviously, again, in terms of measurement standpoints, and obviously setting up timelines and so forth. So I'm just trying to measure my time here as well. So I got about 15 minutes. Okay. So those are some of the things to consider here. The data suggests, again, in terms of, I showed you from Congress that there's qualified, some measured diversified changes, but obviously this is a study by Gooden, suggests that federal employment increased by a little 350,000, but there wasn't a lot of great reflected diversity representation, but not tremendously significant. You wouldn't see much in terms of women in the federal government, or increases in that way. And some of the other areas, some of the things to look at here. So I wanna just turn this around here a little bit and get you to think about things in terms of what is really at stake here, and to try to offer a holistic standpoint and so forth. And some of the people argue, some democratic theorist scholars suggest that it's, again, the idea of the DI model is more about a holistic measure of equity. Certainly there could be more of representative democracy in that kind of context. So there's a lot of different things to look at here, and in many respects, it's really a model designed to promote better performance. And again, I think there are other angles towards that too, in terms of helping people to realize that certainly you have to look at the goals and objectives within an agency and so forth. But we'll get to that a little bit more towards the latter part here. But the idea is I think, putting a lot of perspective into it, it's really in many respects a business strategy, or certainly social equity strategy, but it's certainly designed for efficiency and efficacy and so forth. And so you see the different areas in terms of different diverse representation, certainly looking at it in terms of federal employment, and you see that the federal bureaucracy is, again, the most diverse of all government agencies sections, but there's still ways to go in certainly women and Hispanic groups and so forth. So there's a lot of different things to look at here. I just wanted to get you to think about here, the term equal opportunity is a pretty powerful construct. And I think the idea of to look at that, there's been a tremendous effort on the federal government's part, certainly developing an Office of Diversity and Inclusion, looking at data trends and so forth, but and certainly also through the Office of Personnel Management. I want to just jump forward here a little bit and just give you one angle, and then we'll try to get to a couple, try to pull it all together. There are critiques. It's all about the data. Just because you have a model out there, you need to continue to evaluate. And some people say the federal government hasn't been clear enough. There needs to be more tools and training to analyze data. And that's what I think, that there needs to look at those terms, particularly the hiring practice levels, to measure those, at least certainly to develop long data trends in those areas, particularly in the hiring process. What is the vitality of an employee life cycle? What does that mean? How long is somebody going to stay? Are there other competing factors somebody were to leave, and so forth? what about the role of social media? How does that fit into this area here? Some people argue that there's a lack of urgency too, and obviously federal government goals, are they clear enough within federal government agencies? It's again, there's a question in terms of procedural versus substantive progress. So the other part of my perspective was, or certainly discussion here today, is to get you to think about things in terms of titles 7, Title IX. Those are the benchmarks, obviously, in terms of promoting effective or transparency in terms of recruitment, and not making sure that nobody is subject to hostile work environment through sexual discrimination or sexual harassment and those things. So I think in that kind of context, these are very good guidelines in promoting more viable ways to create an inclusive, positive sum work environment. That doesn't mean you wouldn't have, there could be other issues that come into play, but I just wanted you to give you, at least offer you this framework to consider. Now, obviously, this goes into further into Title IX, again, protecting people, or certainly who will potentially could be harmed and from sexual harassment. And it's not just only just physical, it could be words. So these are all other different things to think about. Training and education are critical to create to promote a tolerant culture and to avoid these concerns of harassment and other forms of discrimination. So I want to consider here, it comes down to leadership. At the end of the day, you could have a strategic plan for diversity, inclusion, for equity, accessibility, but there has to be good leadership, managers who communicate with their employees, and that there's a buy-in from at both levels. And ultimately, you have to think about things in terms of implementation and evaluation as well. So I wanna take the couple minutes I have here just to try to link it. I know the Zoom-A-Palooza has a lot to do with state government. So I thought to myself, well, how do we think about that in this perspective? And I look at the DEI model as certainly an executive order. In some respects, it kind of parallels a mandate policy, because the government's setting a guideline and ultimately figuring out what states could implement. It may not be as a mandate, often is directed through a form of legislation that could be passed by Congress and states apply to. But in this context here, it's done through an executive order. And ultimately, I see a link with both civil rights and environmental policy, because at the same ways, the federal government took the leadership role in both areas, and then you would see states coming in to comply and almost really creating their own initiatives just as strong, if not even stronger than the federal government. So those are some of the things to think about. The idea is that at the end of the day, a program is only as good as how you're able to evaluate it. And ultimately, there needs to be constant feedback loops between the developers of these laws or these rules or ideas and how effective it is, because there's still a lot of open questions to consider here. And ultimately, the way I brought in the environmental component, because I think there was a lot of resistance there at some level in terms of it's viewed as regulatory. And ultimately, there were structures that were put in place called a SIP, or a state implementation plan, which is basically an interpretation of how to interpret a federal mandate. And I felt at some level that may be an interesting parallel to looking at this model. I don't think it's been done before, but I think the idea is that to give that kind of regulatory degrees of freedom to the states to make, or how they see, or how they are able to measure and to evaluate. So it's a different area for us to think about. And, there's a lot of unknowns here. As I said, if environmental components of U.S. states weren't able to follow through, you would actually have federal government taking over. I don't see that taking place. This context in my research, it seems like it's really across the board. A lot of places are embracing this, the DEIA model, and the question is how to evaluate it and to make sure that it's making meaningful measures and certainly helping society grow and so forth. And so the whole idea is to really conduct more research between expected and observed outcomes, and that's kind of my thing to think about. And as I said, I wanted to sum it all up here, at least to try to put some perspective. First of all, the DEIA model there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. I think but I also think that there needs to be increased awareness of the model, the critical nature of it. If you peel it away, you take that away, you take away the construct here, you realize that it's designed to level the playing field. That's an ongoing process. It's not simply just one day or one static goal. It's kind of like always looking at it like a theory of thermodynamics. You're always constantly trying to reach equilibrium. It's a constant struggle, but this is an important consideration. I think it's also a way to think about things in terms of promoting a more accountable and effective agency. And again, there's two ways of looking at that. You can look at it, the federal government as a whole, but also you have to look at it in terms of individual agencies, managers or leaders themselves within those organizations. And that's going to take place as well. So those are the things to think about. I don't think one theory drives this process. I think it's leadership. I think it's effective data collection. And I think that's what it's going to come down to, how people communicate, how people are able to promote a better understanding of why this model developed and what it's trying to accomplish and how many people it can help. At the end of the day, that's what matters the most. So I think that's where I'm right on, just about on pace. I guess I can take questions. Is that?
Yes. I thank you very much, Dr. Gordon. I think it was fascinating to see the data that you presented, but then also to look at the why behind DEIA, of its equal opportunities for people, the normative aspect of things, but it's also creating a more responsive and effective government. And then, so that was very helpful. Thank you very much. I'll take the liberty of asking the first question, and then we'll go over to questions from the audience. But a question I have is, so the NFL has recently had some very public issues with this, with the Rooney Rule, which mandates a minority needs to be in the conversation or at least interviewed for the coaching positions, has led to some very embarrassing things for the NFL, where some of the interviews were just to check a box, and now they're trying to expand that. So I was wondering if there's anything that you've observed that we can learn from the NFL's very public failures from this, and is there anything that can be extrapolated into our understanding of government?
That's a great question. It's interesting. I used the Rooney Rule in the personnel class, and I think it's, at the end of the day, there needs to be accountability in terms of making a group discussion about who is being selected to interview for positions, and to be clear that it's not just simply a pro forma component. I'm not saying that's a simple way to meet, but I think there needs to be accountability from decision makers about who they're going to interview, that it's not just simply some sort of sham and just bring somebody, a minority candidate, and just satisfy this Rooney Rule component. I think that's an ongoing concern. It comes down, in my perspective, it comes down to transparency and group theory or group discussions, to be able to have not just to have different stakeholders involved. Maybe there could be a component of having in those selection processes that take place, to have an outside party to be involved with something like that, so that it could offer a sense of neutrality and certainly objectiveness beyond just simply the initial inside stakeholders and so forth. So, I mean, that's an ongoing concern. I find that troubling, but challenging, and it'd be interesting to see how this model is able to meet those needs. But you're right. I mean, there are some real questions in terms of that. But I think maybe a neutral outside observers to be also part of that decision process. Sometimes it's kind of like when you have somebody, you interview somebody, you have a compliance officer. Well, maybe there needs to be something in that kind of context as well, just to show there's as much transparency as possible for the positive good. Now, you say that in terms of how does that relate to the government? Is that what's the latter part of the question?
That's correct. Anything we can extrapolate, or these?
Yeah, it's the same idea. Yeah, I think at some level, you know, it's interesting. Somebody who doesn't get a position, you know, there's always disappointment, frustration, et cetera, et cetera. I think there needs to be clear and defined goals about how the hiring process takes place, and ultimately, as much as you can communicate with the candidate, how that process, who's going to do the interviewing, types of questions, and so forth, the consistency. I think those things all have to come into play. The component in terms of the outcomes, that's where I think the devil is, ultimately trying to figure out how effective is a program like this going to be. That is where I think there has to be clear expectations and good data management. That, in my purview, is what's going to drive the success of this program. The idea, or the ultimate outcome of the program, how it plays out. The idea is that there needs to be understanding about how it's not just the inclusiveness, but are we retaining people for work? Are there competing perspectives why people are leaving for work? There needs to be almost like a multifaceted playbook to understand the different trajectories about tracking the recruitment and life of a potential employee. So that's where I think good data management has to come into play to address these concerns. Does it simply dismiss or overcome the Rooney Rule controversy? I'm not sure, but I think the more data we have, we can see, I think it provides more legitimate, it provides greater strength for this program.
Thank you. I think it's interesting to see how good data management can help us understand retention and some of these bigger trends.
Absolutely. You know, when you talk about data management, I mean, I know I'm privy to it because I'm always tracking who we bring in as director here, to students who are coming in and where they're going to be placed and so on. But data is important, and we need to be able to come up with clear, measurable questions on these different variables within the DIA model, and to understand it's not just simply the federal government, but particular agencies, and that could be transposed back to the state level as well. That's what has to be done. And then when we have more data sets about that, I think it gives us a better picture. We're kind of early in this kind of context because on the one hand, we have, you know, the initial federal executive order is about 10 years old, and we see more with the current administration promoting that. But again, I say this with legal frameworks as well, there's a difference between procedural and substantive results. One thing what you're going to say, it's another thing what you're going to do and what the outcomes are. And that's kind of where we are right now.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to go on to a couple more questions that we had from the audience. One is, are there any valid as in non-discriminatory or racist criticisms or identifiable shortcomings of current DEI strategies and practices?
Well, I mean, I think the whole idea within the DIA model is to create this inclusiveness. In terms of understanding the criticism is the testing of it. I think that's where I would look at the components. I think to raise that question, Susan Gooden actually had put together one of the. I cited her a little bit here, but she offers insight about the promotion of the program, but the questions in terms of the monitoring of it and data collection. As a study, ultimately just simply contrarian to it, I'd have to look more specific into it, but I think it comes down to measurement, as I think it's Chief Tain critique of it, and ultimately you may want to think about it in terms of effective literature in terms of what constructs best hiring practices. So there's some literature out there that will look at things in terms of focusing on you hire somebody by just simply classification under their particular position, so a particular title, or by qualifications by a particular skills. Maybe there's some literature perspectives about that. It takes a more narrow approach, but I haven't seen in particular a study just simply to be objectively or opposed to. I think that the questions are, what's it going to prove? That's kind of the questions that the biggest critique that I've seen. And I've seen that even within camps that suggest they're favorable to the DIA model. Question is, how do you prove it?
Great, thank you. And just one more reminder for our audience members, you can use the Q&A feature or put the questions directly into the chat. Another question we have, as we know, not everyone is treated equally in the system, as we see by the disparities in sentencing and arrests. Do you have any suggestions as to what is the most important issue or topic that I should include in my class in regards to the criminal justice system? This is coming from Dr. Black, who's developing coursework in race inequality in the criminal justice system.
I do. A couple of things, actually. If you're looking at it, maybe something about the, at least coming from California at the time I spent out there, is the 3 strikes law, which is essentially to be racially tinged in some respects, in terms of the whole theory behind it was that if you committed one felony, or it was one felony, you could do small things, you could actually go to prison for life. And it really created a very unfair sentencing guideline. It may have had racial disparities with that. It also caused California to not balance their budget because they started putting people in prison and it was just too expensive. It created all sorts of issues. I think the 3 strikes law, a lot of people argue that it was inherently unfair. It's also, there's questions in terms of, I would recommend federal guidelines on small drug convictions. I used to, or when I teach policy analysis, I show some of those issues. There's a very good documentary about, it's called, about a basketball player who was going to go to the NBA and he died of a drug overdose, and then the government cracked down on people who had small levels of cocaine in Washington, D.C. area, and it created a whole slew of one effect after another. The documentary was put together by ESPN. It's called Without Bias. Len Bias is the player. I don't know. For young people, they may not have heard of him, but he was drafted by the Celtics, and then ultimately he died before he got the chance to play for them. So it's very powerful documentary, and it's really, but it's not just the documentary part. It goes into the unfair federal sentencing guidelines and what the implication of that. So basically what happened was it created like an action-reaction system. The government tried to crack down on small drug infractions and ultimately put lots of people in prison for years upon years and never even addressed the source of the problem. So that's kind of how I would look at some of those questions to think about. I mean, it's a pretty powerful, documented, powerful story. I'm old, I remember the story, so I remember when it happened. It was really something to look at. So I thought maybe that could help.
And we have time for just a couple more questions. This next one about social media. You mentioned social media as a challenge. How can social media be better utilized to support DEI objectives?
I think the whole idea is to make sure that information is clear. There's good case studies. There's positive outcomes. They need to be able to utilize it. That people are going to frequent it. Are going to be able to show in short way to use information effectively. So social media is and I think it's not just simply going on to other websites like Quora or when people ask questions about different things and so forth. I think it's got to be within their own agency website. There needs to be a good way to show how what the model is, how it works, but in a short way. I mean, you take too much information, no one's gonna watch it. I'm dealing with a lot of these issues, social media with marketing a program. You have to be clear. You have to show ultimately how an agency is particularly inviting and the impact towards a local community. And that would make a big difference.
Great, thank you. And final question is about comparative politics and looking at what other countries are doing. Are there lessons that we can learn from other countries about their efforts for DEI in government? Are there any countries that do this especially well or notable failures we could learn from?
That's an excellent question. You know, I have a lot of international students in my program, and I thought he was going to come on to the program today, but I don't know what happened. But he's from Japan, and he doesn't. I asked him about their DEI models. He doesn't know about it, and that's what he's researching right now, developing a recruitment plan for the Japanese foreign affairs and so forth. So I think, you know, we can be critical and really be tough on ourselves, saying we could do more. But it's an important. There's a lot of progress that's been made. Obviously, more can be done in that perspective. I think the DEI model, the best way I would be able to approach it is trying to link it to the welfare state. Which states ultimately, when I say welfare state, it's basically for what we're protective to help vulnerable people or people who are retiring and so forth. Doesn't necessarily mean just people on welfare or something like that. But states that have a broader social policy where you pay more taxes and so forth, that may be interesting to look at in terms of how they're being inclusive. But then again, I don't know exactly how extensive some of maybe in Europe as diverse. So certainly some of the Scandinavian countries, there's been some studies that have been addressed on that. But I think that could warrant, there's a link there between a government that provides a safety network for people as well as being inclusive. That's at least my hypothesis, or my theoretical framework. I think there is that connection to be able to, a society that is extensive or that's involved in helping all sorts of groups, certainly chances are there's a connection to a broader social policy, even beyond just from the hiring practices. That's something to be considered. I would suggest looking at certainly Western Europe or some of those countries, but it really doesn't have to be circumscribed to any one specific area. It's really something to look at, and certainly warrants further assessment. In the studies that are certainly what I teach, we do have a comparative European chapter, and we look at Western Europe. So that's just some of the angles towards it. I would think that's where I would look as a scholar to look at some of the baseline perspectives about how this model could be enhanced or new ideas where it could come from.
Well, Dr. Gordon, this has been a great conversation. Where can people go to learn more about your work?
Well, certainly we have our website here in terms of at the mpa.etsu.edu. So we can put stuff up there too. We're actually in I'm doing some recordings of students and a little overview of the program. We're posting more stuff on the website. I also have a LinkedIn account, so I could send it to people. It's fledgling though; it's just a little one. So I'm getting there. I'm getting there. But the idea is that I'm putting up. I have a student helping me tomorrow with some of that stuff coming in, and we have some student testimonials we're putting up too. So that's what's going on.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Once again, that was Dr. Fred Gordon from ETSU. And I would